Unwanted infants in ancient Rome were abandoned outside the city walls. Are you kidding me? Some sports star who just literally gave birth and threw her infant in a trash can? Deadbeat parents who don't feed, who abuse their children? The fact that there's universal outrage when a child dies from starvation and neglect in the land of the free and the home of the brave, they can be abused and dismissed anytime we need to. If I had told you 10 years ago that that would be not just happening, but it would be escalating, you would not have believed me. Did you know that abortion was a super hip and popular practice in ancient Rome? Yep. What did Christians in Rome do to combat abortion? Did they say, that's wrong, but you do you? In the Roman Empire, the cultural and political norm was that the father had to accept the child into his family when they were born. The child only gained rights if their parent claimed them. Sound familiar? Today, we're diving into what the culture of death looked like in ancient Rome and how the early church prevailed against evil. You may have never heard any of these stories before about the early church heroes and ancient evils that we see as a renaissance in modern culture today. But how can we stop what we're seeing if we don't remember who we are and where we came from? What does Christendom mean? We're getting into all of that today. Give us a rating and review. Help us reach more people. I've been reading your reviews, by the way. It really means a lot to me. Thank you guys for doing that. If you haven't done that and you're a listener to the show, hop on over to iTunes. I don't know if Spotify lets you do a review, but if you're on Spotify, give it 5 stars. If you're on iTunes, give it 5 stars and then write a little review. Let us know what you think about the show. Ask a question, make a recommendation. We love to read that all. Follow me on Rumble because the Google overlords at YouTube actually, I told you guys, we actually lost the whole channel for 2 days. They said that it was for violating like nudity, like protocols, like. Okay, yeah, we don't post nudity on my, what are you talking about? You can literally watch softcore porn if you want to on YouTube. It's disgusting. But of course, my channel just got deleted for 2 days. I told you they've been trying to axe the show. So support us. Okay, help us. Go subscribe at Rumble in case this show ever gets permanently removed off of YouTube. And support us. Support our fight for life in the media, in the public square, with our resistance chapters, awakening and mobilizing the local church to be great again against evil, and the target that we're getting put on our back by the radical left and the media. We've had whole articles written about me recently trying to debunk the whole organization. Go to thewhiterose.life, sign up as an ally at $35 a month, or air support at $70 a month, or Spitfire at $140 a month. Whatever you can do, jump on our White Rose app. You get the battle box in the mail. You join our live calls. We have activism courses, training courses, apologetic courses, worldview courses. $70 a month, you join our book club. If you want to read books with me, we talk about it on Zoom. Come on, come hang out with us. Whatever you can do, it means so much to us. Let's get into it. This is the Seth Gruber Show. Abortion, infanticide, exposure, and abandonment, child abandonment, have always been a normal and natural part of human relations. Since the dawning of time, men have contrived ingenious diversions to satisfy their fallen passions, and child killing has always been chief among them. Virtually every culture in antiquity was stained with the blood of innocent children. Unwanted infants in ancient Rome were abandoned outside the city walls to die from exposure to the elements or from the attacks of wild foraging beasts. The Greeks often gave pregnant women heavy doses of herbal or medicinal abortifacients. The Persians developed highly sophisticated surgical curette procedures to cause abortions. Chinese women tied heavy ropes around their waists so excruciatingly tight that they either aborted or passed into unconsciousness. Ancient Hindus and Arabs concocted chemical pessaries, that is abortifacients, that were pushed or pumped directly into the womb through the birth canal. Primitive Canaanites threw their children onto great flaming pyres. as a sacrifice to their god Molech. The Polynesians subjected their pregnant women to onerous tortures, their abdomens beaten with heavy stones and hot coals heaped upon their bodies. Japanese women straddling boiling cauldrons of parricidal brews. Egyptians disposed of their unwanted children, especially little girls, by disemboweling and dismembering them, and their collagen was then ritually harvested for the manufacture of cosmetic creams. None of the great minds of the ancient world, from Plato and Aristotle to Seneca and Quintilian, from Pythagoras to Aristophanes to Livy and Cicero, from Herodotus to Thucydides to Plutarch and Euripides, disparaged child killing in any way. In fact, most of them recommended it. They callously discussed its various methods and procedures. They casually debated its sundry legal ramifications. They blithely tossed lives like dice. Abortion, infanticide, exposure, and abandonment were so much a part of human societies that they provided the primary motif in popular tradition, stories, myth, fables, and legends. That is from my mentor, Dr. George Grant's book, The Third Time Around. We have breathed in the air of Christendom for so long, generations actually, that we have forgotten that concepts like human rights, the sanctity of life, human exceptionalism, and the rule of law are not the norm. They're the exception. America is not the norm. It's the exception. Treating human beings with dignity and value and worth is not the norm. It's the exception. This is an interesting observation that Tom Holland makes in his book Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. I recommend you read it. He's an interesting guy. He's actually not a Christian. He seems like Jordan Peterson to maybe be on the verge, on the precipice, but he does not acknowledge the kingship of Jesus as the Son of God and is not repented of his sins. And yet he makes this incredible defense of Christendom, of Christianity, if you will, in his book Dominion, which was just published a few years ago, maybe 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. And he basically makes the point that Christianity's enduring impact and legacy is so powerful that you wouldn't even have had the Beatles' love movement or the hippie movement or the woke movement if it had not been for Christianity. Like the whole thing about like, oh, trans people are being targeted. They're the targeted minorities and we need to support and love them. Like that whole woke sort of mindset, what they're taking aspects of Christianity, but it's all perverted, right? and they're emphasizing fundamentally Christian virtues. Love the least of these. Protect the disenfranchised. Rally around those who are being targeted, who are being taken advantage of, the weak, the unloved, the unlovely. Like all of these sort of aspects that the left pretends to embody are themselves trace elements of Christianity. And he makes this interesting observation. Obviously, don't hear me wrong. It's all twisted and warped, right? That's why G.K. Chesterton said the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from one another and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth and their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians care only for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful. Chesterton, it's the first. That's toxic empathy before Joe Rigney or Ali Beth Stuckey wrote about it. The virtues have been isolated from one another and they're wandering alone. Right, so obviously that's what the left does. That's what wokeism does, right? It says compassion, but there's no truth to it. But my point is that the fact that those are even a priority within the woke movement at all is because of Christendom. And Tom Holland makes his point. He says, the trace elements of Christianity continue to infuse people's morals and presumptions so utterly that many failed even to detect their presence like dust particles, so fine as to be invisible to the naked eye, they were breathed in equally by everyone. Believers, atheists, and those who never paused so much as to think about religion. Had it been otherwise, then no one would have ever got woke. What's his point? What's my point? Is that the very fact that we're horrified by that recent story of was it the Arkansas or Kentucky? I don't remember. A student, some sports star who just literally gave birth and threw her infant in a trash can. The fact that we're horrified by deadbeat parents who don't feed, who abuse their children. The fact that there's universal outrage when a child dies from starvation and neglect in the land of the free and the home of the brave is itself proof of the enduring legacy and power and truth of Christianity. Have you seen those memes where it's like all these knights are around a table and they're all putting their swords in the middle? It's like the one time that everyone agrees on something or something like that, you know? That would be an example of that. Like, toddlers shouldn't be starved to death and neglected by their parents. And like the atheists put their swords down and the deist puts their sword down. And by the way, the people at the Satanic Temple put their sword down. Like, why do we all agree on that? Because of the enduring, powerful legacy of Christianity. Prior to the concepts of the image of God, the sanctity of human life, which only come from Christianity, it was not normal or normative or common to view anyone but yourself as valuable. Certainly not children, the weak. Are you kidding me? They can be abused and dismissed anytime we need to if it supports me in my self-actualization. This is something that we in the West, particularly in America, have completely forgotten. I want to talk about all of this today. This opening line from Dr. George Grant of how common and normative it was to kill, dismiss, and abandon your children is a sobering reminder for us in America today that if we do not return to really what is the heritage of Christianity, of Christendom, which is Christian resistance against evil, if that doesn't become our MO, our calling card, our normal reaction to evil again, there's no reason why we can't go back to some of the most evil and atrocious and banal acts of evil again. And we're seeing it all across the West. I mean, these are things that we talk about on the show, right? We talk about the fact that more babies are killed through in vitro fertilization every year than are killed through the abortion industry. We talk about states that are creating transgender safe haven laws where, let's say, an aunt could take her nephew without her sister or brother's consent to have her nephew go across state lines to a trans state haven to have her nephew's minor's genitals cut off and pumped full of estrogen. Like literally trans youth kidnapping and trafficking. Like some of these things that we talk about on the show, if I had told you 10 years ago that would be not just happening, but it would be escalating and happening all across the country, you would not have believed me. You would have called me a conspiracy theorist. You would have told me to stop getting high off of my own supply. And yet here we are. What's my point? How quickly we can regress back to some of the most ancient, evil, and banal acts of evil that for centuries were the norm in civilizations. Nearly every civilization in human history exercised human sacrifice at one point or another. And we're shocked and surprised at some of the stories we see across the West and America of how children and the family are being targeted and disintegrated and sexualized and abused. Why are we surprised by these things? Because we've been breathing in the air of Christendom so long, we forget from where those great traditions and values come from. Dr. Grant talks about the founding of Rome, which was in myth presumed to be the result of the abandonment of children. The abandonment and abuse of kids, of babies, of children was so normal, it became the sort of motif of myths and legends. Well, why would people be writing myths and legends and stories that had child abandonment at its center if it wasn't so normal to those civilizations? It's just proof of what I'm saying. According to the mythical origin of Rome, a virgin who had been raped bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus, right, who end up being abandoned. They're raised by a she-wolf. Later, a shepherd discovers them, brings them home to him and his wife. They raise these children, and Romulus and Remus would later establish the city of Rome on the 7 hills near the place of their rescue. Like, that's just one example. There's many, many more, of course. Because these people had been mired by the minions of sin and death, as Dr. Grant says, it was as natural as the spring rains for the men and women of antiquity to kill their children. It was as instinctive as the autumn harvest for them to summarily sabotage their own heritage. They saw nothing particularly cruel about despoiling the fruit of their wombs. It was woven into the very fabric of their culture. They believed that it was completely justifiable. They believed that it was just and good and right. So that's the kind of culture. That's the kind of civilization. That's the context in which Christ enters the world. Those are the pagan virtues, if you will. We should call them vices, of course. But these are the pagan norms of the civilization in which Christ enters the world, establishes his church, preaches a gospel that is an upside down kingdom from what everyone knows at that time. I mean, even the Jews hated the Gentiles. I mean, absolutely. I mean, they weren't just enemies. They were evil. And preaches that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. This complete inversion. Spends times with the sick and the deformed and the lepers and the blind and those on the margins of society, and communicates that these people are just as precious and valuable in the eyes of God as the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the rich. Establishes his church and says the gates of hell will not prevail against my church, which, by the way, assumes like forward momentum, right? If the gates of hell will not prevail against, what is there to hold against the church moving forward? The gates of hell won't prevail against a forward moving church. Okay. This changes the world. And so I thought maybe it would be fun to tell a few of the stories of the patristics, of the early church fathers, of those heroes who were facing the same kinds of evils that we're facing today, except they were way more normalized, way more socially acceptable, and way more celebrated than what we're seeing in the West today. You know, in my debates and conversations, both online and in person, you'll often find the left arguing that, you know, the Bible's not pro-life. Christianity's not pro-life. Leftist liberal theologians who are really just apostate, they love to argue this too. They love to say that, like, there's nothing in the Bible that says that forbids abortion. The patristics, the early church, they didn't even talk about abortion. Well, what are you talking about, Seth? What kind of historical argument could you make? The tradition of Christianity in its first 400 years was robustly pro-life. That just wasn't there. There's no reason. Like, that's a very common, actually, talking point on the left, both on the religious left, which, again, we're just talking about apostates, you know, United Methodists, Episcopalians, etc., and on the pagan left, who just think that somehow, I mean, this was the whole thing with the moral majority, right? Like, the left would talk about the moral majority harping on the pro-life issue as a way to accrue political power, and that was the first time that the Christian church really unified against quote unquote women's rights, against child killing, against abortion, and that this was some new advent in the history of the church. You hear this all the time. The Christian church didn't start caring about babies until 1973. That's horse manure. That is completely anti-historical, okay? And so why not give you a little bit of historical power and history and arguments to be able to counter a lot of this. Because, listen, you don't know where you're going until you know where you've come from. I love this line from Chesterton. He says, the disadvantage of men not knowing the past is that they do not know the present. He says, history is a hill or high point of vantage from which alone men see the town in which they live or the age in which they are living. Isn't that beautiful? The disadvantage of men not knowing the past is that they do not know the present. History is like walking up on the highest knoll or hill in your village and looking down. And from that vantage point alone, can you see where you're living and the age in which you live? That's what history is. But most of us don't know the history of who we are, where we've come from, the heritage of our faith. And so we're not very good at navigating the 21st century, are we? We miss the signs of the times that earlier church fathers would have immediately identified by going, oh, I've seen that before. But we miss these things, these renaissances of paganism, because we've forgotten who we are. I think it's Psalm 87 says something like, righteousness cannot be done in a land of forgetfulness. Isn't that beautiful? Righteousness cannot be done in a land of forgetfulness. Well, maybe that's why the evangelical church is not very good at establishing righteousness against all the evil that we're seeing in America, because we've forgotten. It's like Jill Pole in The Silver Chair, who after Eustace Clarence Scrubb, a name that he almost deserves, gets sent off into Aslan's country, and Jill is on Aslan's mountain, and before she's blown by Aslan into Narnia, he says, I have a mission for you, Jill, but I need you to remember the signs that I'm going to give you to accomplish this mission, to free the prince and break the spell and free the land. Because when you descend down into Narnia, your mind will fog and you'll forget the signs. You'll miss them. So remember the signs. Say them to yourself when you wake in the morning and when you lie down at night and when you wake in the middle of the night, and whatever strange things may happen to you, let nothing turn your mind from following the signs. Remember the signs, believe the signs. Nothing else matters. Of course, Jill forgets to repeat the signs to herself, and her forgetfulness gets her and her friends into much trouble. We've done the same thing in the West and in the American church. Righteousness cannot be done in a land of forgetfulness. There's so much more to say, but first we want to thank our sponsor of the Seth Gruber Show, Every Life Diaper Company. Listen, I'm just going to keep saying this because I think that if millions of Christians, who, by the way, are outbreeding the left and having all of the babies, we're the only ones above replacement rate, I think. Well, except the Muslims, but that's a conversation for another time. If we just all stopped purchasing child baby needs from left-wing woke pro-abortion companies, we could start bankrupting woke corporatism, and that would be a great win for the American family. If you are having babies, if your loved ones are having babies, if you're a grandma or grandpa and you want to give something to your kids or grandkids, the nursery at your church, for goodness sake, should not be buying from Coterie or Huggies, who all support abortion. That's right. Did you know every major American diaper company supports abortion in some way, shape, or form? What? How could the people who profit when more babies are born help subsidize and financially or rhetorically support the killing of their clientele base? I don't know. Make it make sense. You have to fight back with your wallet. We as American Christians need to actually treat our money as a way to fight for righteousness. Get your diapers, baby wipes, and now shampoos and body washes, non-toxic, baby, from Every Life Diaper Company. Go to everylife.com, use promo code Seth10, that's Seth10, Seth10 to get 10% off your first order. That lets them know that we sent you, and so they can see, hey, the Seth Gruber Show listeners, they're actually making a difference for life and growing their business. Yes, we want to help grow businesses that support babies and not killing them. Go to everylife.com, promo code Seth10. Thank you, Every Life, for being a sponsor of the Seth Gruber Show. I don't claim to be a historian. I just try to study and navigate what I'm seeing and maybe help you to do so. You should go read books by David Barton and Bill Federer and Dr. George Grant. But I thought on this show we'd maybe share some of those stories to remind ourselves why we take things like the sanctity of life for granted today, and to inspire us to stand for resistance and reformation in our day. I told this story in my book, The 1916 Project, in one of the later chapters, if you'd like to go read it. But it's about St. Basil of Caesarea, a beautiful example of what we need in the church today, which is a bold proclamation of the truth and actually action-oriented, feet to our faith action against evil, because Christianity has always been pro-life. It has always stood against the norms of culture. Which is why, by the way, Christianity changed culture, because it stood in the midst of culture, but it stood apart from culture. St. Basil of Caesarea is one of my favorite stories to tell. One evening, Vespers had ended, and although it was late in the evening, there was one more act of devotion that Basil had to perform. With some deacons following close behind, he led the way to a pagan shrine in the city. Though Christianity had been recognized as an official religion throughout the Roman Empire some 4 decades prior, the evil of the darkest kind still held firm roots in various places. Caesarea in Cappadocia was one of them. It's hard to imagine venerating such an abominable practice in stone, but there it was before his open eyes, a shrine to infanticide. The men of his church could have circulated a petition in service of removing it from public view, or they could have written a strongly worded letter to the civil magistrates. But there are some things so wicked that they cannot be tolerated. Under the night sky, with the moon and stars as their light, Basil and those deacons of his church tore down the shrine, stone by stone, bit by bit, with their bare hands. It would no longer serve as a beacon for murder. Now, Basil of Caesarea was an influential church leader in the 4th century. That's right. But his influence far outlasted him. Having been born into a prominent and wealthy family, he could have chosen literally any career path, but Basil chose to follow God's calling into the ministry, and his assignment was to serve the people of Caesarea. As soon as he arrived, he witnessed the plight of the sick and the poor in his new community. So he began administering the most potent form of medicine at his disposal, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Basil is said to have conducted 18 church services a week and more in the days leading up to Christianity's high holy days of Easter and Christmas. But Basil did more than preach the good news of the kingdom. He also demonstrated the good news by promoting almsgiving in the church and by establishing the very first non-ambulatory hospital. Did you know that's the origin of hospitals? Non-ambulatory hospitals is Basil, church father from the 4th century. It was Basil's entrance into the healthcare arena that first brought him into conflict with the vile practitioners of abortion, infanticide, and child exposure and abandonment in his community. Now, Christianity was at this time widely accepted, but there were still large segments of the population who had yet to be evangelized, and the most distinguishing elements of pagan culture persisted. And this was when, actually, to Basil's shock, killing children before and after birth by a variety of methods was still legal. Basil discovered a guild of abortionists selling potions, devices, and surgical procedures to end the lives of unborn children. They would then sell the remains of the children they murdered to Egyptian cosmetologists to create makeup. Rather than seeing such a depraved and diabolical industry as a complicated issue that must be approached with nuance so as not to offend any non-Christians visiting on a Sunday morning, as some might today, Basil faced this evil head on. He began preaching vehemently against the evils of abortion and infanticide, while simultaneously teaching on the sanctity of human life. He started a citywide education initiative to make sure everyone understood what was happening and how it was neither right nor good for society. He organized his church to care for families in need and women in crisis pregnancies. Basil used his significant powers of communication and persuasion and his family's substantial influence to lobby for changes in the law. He used the authority of his office to denounce the abortionist guild as anathema, which would excommunicated its members from the church. And he led protests against the Egyptian traders who purchased the bodies of murdered babies. It wasn't only the active killing of children that Basil fought against. There was also the ancient tradition of child abandonment. This is key to understanding ancient Rome and the Roman Empire at the time. In the Roman Empire, a child was not simply born into a family. Rather, the father had to decide to accept the child, had to approve that child's existence and participation in the family. Until he did that, that child had no rights or protections whatsoever. That meant, what does this mean? A newborn baby could simply be abandoned and left for dead. This was neither a crime, nor was there a social stigma attached to the practice. High places and walls were built outside of Roman cities, especially for this purpose: child abandonment. A baby could be left for dead, cold and alone, atop one of these monuments to die from exposure to the elements. It was a shrine such as this that Basil and his deacons toppled with their bare hands. Basil was in fact so bold in his efforts that word of his actions reached Emperor Valentinian in Rome. Valentinian was so convinced by Basil's argument against the murder of the unborn and the born alike that he issued a decree in 374 which ordered all parents must support their children conceived. Those who brutalize or abandon them should be subject to the full penalty prescribed by law. And with the stroke of his imperial pen, Valentinian made abortion, infanticide, abandonment, and exposure illegal. It was the first time in human recorded history that such a thing had happened. And it was Basil of Caesarea who led the charge. Do you know this history? Does your pastor know this history? Do pro-lifers know this history? Basil died just 4 years after that at the age of 50 years old, but his influence lived on for centuries. Who knows how many millions of children were saved because of his heroic choice to stand up to wickedness? Not only did he save those lives, but he also altered the direction of an entire culture, revealing centuries-old practices to be despicable acts of evil that should be unthinkable for anyone with a conscience, let alone those who bear the name of Christ. Saint Basil the Great, he's called, 4th century bishop of Caesarea. Saint Basil wrote this. He said, "A woman who deliberately destroys a fetus is answerable for murder. And any fine distinction between a formed and unformed fetus is not admissible among us." It's bold language. One of the patristics, one of the church fathers. He must have just been a MAGA Christian nationalist, right? Who cared more about political power than biblical fidelity. This was the norm. Another one of my favorites is Callistus of Rome. Long before Basil, actually, courageous men and women fought against the tide of darkness in their spheres of influence. And in the 2nd century AD, Callistus was one such man. Inspiring story. Unlike Basil, Callistus didn't come from wealth and privilege. Callistus was a slave, and not a very good one. His master had taken up a collection for the poor and had entrusted Callistus with it, and Callistus lost the money. Some believe he stole it, which may well have been the case because he fled for his life afterwards, but he was soon arrested and returned to his master. A short while later, he was arrested again, this time for fighting in a synagogue. Apparently, he was trying to borrow money or collect old debts from some Jews, and his efforts ended in violence. At this point, Callistus was denounced by the church and sentenced to hard labor in the mines of Sardinia. He might have disappeared from history altogether if his story ended here. But due to the mercy of Hyacinthus, a Christian who had the ear of one of the emperor's mistresses, he was released and brought to the coast to recuperate from the toll that the mines had taken on his body. Callistus was given a pension from the state, and once he recovered, he received a new commission and assignment from the church. Pope Zephyrinus made him a deacon and caretaker of the first piece of real estate the church had ever owned, a cemetery along the Appian Way. The Apostle Paul mentions those of Appia in Acts. It's referring to the Appian Way. I was there recently, and it was the mainstay or travel road in and out of Rome at the time. Because the site was church property, it was also a shelter for the poor and the hungry. Callistus's job was to tend the grounds and the needs of those who sought refuge there. His job became one big advertisement for the Christian faith, because Christian burial practices demonstrated hope in a future resurrection, while pagans often burned their bodies since they saw no future for them. But Christians planted their bodies in the ground like seeds waiting for spring. And when it came to Callistus's care for the poor, it was an echo of God's love for lost sinners. Along the well-traveled Appian Way, people from nearly every walk of life came face to face with a gospel that challenged their assumptions about the nature of reality. However, Callistus's greatest impact on the Roman world of his day was when he decided to do something about a diabolical sin that plagued the culture. As you know from Basil of Caesarea's story, the abandonment of infants was an acceptable and legal practice in the Roman Empire. There was no shame in leaving a newborn on a wall or a garbage heap or even a dung pile. Callistus discovered this and galvanized efforts to seek out and retrieve and rescue these tiny, struggling babies from trash heaps or high places and raise them in Christian homes. These initiatives received a name called Life Watches, where Christians would watch trash heaps or high places where babies were abandoned to die by the Romans, rescue them, and raise them in the admonition and fear of the Lord. These life watches saved hundreds of boys and girls from certain death, and it's one of the reasons that the early church was so diverse, because they were literally rescuing abandoned infants. Some years later, Callistus was chosen to be the Bishop of Rome. So, pretty cool story. The entire patristic era and the founding years of the church are one unified pro-life testimony, regardless of what you hear to the contrary. I'll give you some quotes, by the way, from documents and early Christian writings that all of the early Christian church would have written. Many of these writings would have been read aloud in Christian circles. Okay, call them Christian commentary and, discipleship Bible study writings of the era. The Didache was a compilation of apostolic moral teachings that appeared at the end of the first century. And among its many teachings, we find a reverence for the sanctity of life. It says, quote, "There are two ways, the way of life and the way of death. And the difference between these two ways is great. Therefore, do not murder a child by abortion or kill a newborn infant," end quote. The Epistle of Barnabas was an early 2nd century theological tract that was highly recommended by the first Christian communities. Like the Didache, it also had commandments against abortion and infanticide. It said, "You shall love your neighbor more than your own life. You shall not slay a child by abortion. You shall not kill that which has already been generated." How about this one? The 2nd century judicial theorist and Christian apologist Athanasius, in a letter to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, wrote, "We say that women who induce abortions are murderers and will have to give account of it to God. The fetus in the womb is a living being and therefore the object of God's care." In the 3rd century, pastor and theologian Clement of Alexandria said, quote, "Our whole life can proceed according to God's perfect plan if only we gain dominion over our desires, practicing continence from the beginning instead of destroying through perverse and pernicious arts human offspring who are given birth by divine providence. Those who use abortifacient medicine to hide their fornication cause not only the outright murder of the fetus, but of the whole human race as well." Okay. Also in the 3rd century, Tertullian composed his Apology. There he connected the sanctity of life to the gospel itself and said, "Our faith declares life out of death. Therefore, murder is forbidden once and for all. We may not destroy even the fetus in the womb. To hinder a birth is merely a speedier man-killing. Thus, it does not matter whether you take away a life that is born or destroy one that is coming to birth. In both instances, destruction is murder." End quote. Ambrose, the renowned and reverend bishop of Milan, was bold in his condemnation of those who engaged in child-killing procedures. He said, "They deny in their very womb their own progeny. They use parasital mixtures. They snuff out the fruit of their wombs. In this way, life is taken before it is given. Who except man himself has taught us ways of repudiating our own children?" Similarly, the great Latin scholar Jerome added his voice, saying, "Those who drink potions to ensure sterility are guilty of rebuffing God's own blessings. Some, when they learn that the potions have failed and thus are with child through sin, they practice abortion by use of still other potions. They are then guilty of 3 crimes: self-mutilation, adultery, and the murder of an unborn child." End quote. What about Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, condemned those whose, quote, "lustful cruelty drove them to extremes." And he says, quote, "They provoke women to such extravagant methods as to use poisonous drugs to secure barrenness, or else, if unsuccessful in this, to murder the unborn child." End quote. The sentences of Pseudo-Phiocles, written between 50 BC and 80 50, says, quote, "A woman should not destroy the unborn babe in her belly, nor after its birth throw it before the dogs and vultures." The Sibylline oracles includes among the wicked those who, quote, "produce abortions and unlawfully cast their offspring away." First Enoch, written 1st or 2nd century BC, says that an evil angel taught humans how to, quote, "smash the embryo in the womb," end quote. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher, between 25 BC and 80 41, rejected the notion that the fetus is merely part of the mother's body. Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian, said, "The law orders all the offspring be brought up and forbids women either to cause abortion or to make away with the fetus. A woman who did so was considered to have committed infanticide because she destroyed a soul and hence diminished the race." And the 5th century church father John Chrysostom called abortion worse than murder, asking, "Why then do you abuse the gift of God and make the chamber of procreation a chamber for murder and arm the woman that was given childbearing unto slaughter?" Anyone who tells you that the early church was not pro-life and that the pro-life movement began in 1973 is lying to you. My last favorite story of this era, to remind us where we've come from and the heritage and mantle of our faith in opposition to culture, is Athanasius. You know, the writings of the early church fathers are eminently readable. In fact, nearly every generation of Christians until the end of the 19th century made a study of the patristics an essential part of their education. And all of these men not only advocated for unborn life, but also stood for the preservation of doctrine and Christendom and culture. And among this great hall of witnesses, I want to focus on one more man, a man who lived a furious and controversial life, but whose personal piety earned him the epitaph Athanasius contra mundum. It means Athanasius against the world. A young deacon from Alexandria, Athanasius, was one of the giants of the church's patristic age. In fact, if there was one person who could be credited with preserving the Christian faith from the rising waves of heresy during the 4th century, it would be Athanasius. He was involved in various conflicts in the arena of politics, the arts, and liturgy. He wrote a short classic called On the Incarnation, which is still a staple of any solid theological education today, which amazingly he wrote when he was 15 years old. He took a leading role in shaping the Nicene Creed, the simplest profession of the Christian faith. But Athanasius not only professed his faith by mouth, he lived it out with his hands and feet. According to oral tradition, it says that one year on the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the Sunday between Christmas and Epiphany, the Feast of the Holy Innocents is remembering Herod's slaughter of the babies. Athanasius led a procession from the church to the edge of the city of Alexandria. Now, ancient Roman walls, as I've told you, had become a place to leave unwanted babies to die. No laws existed to prohibit this act, but it was done in secret at the edge of the city because, like Cain and Abel, well, innocent blood cries out from the ground. But the church heard their cry and boldly responded. Athanasius and the local church together tore down the old Roman infanticide walls in a bold symbolic act of Christendom reclaiming culture. They stood at the gates of hell and proclaimed, "Death is not welcome here." Soon after the death of Athanasius, Roman emperors Valentinian and Theodosius, like in the story of St. Basil, issued edicts banning child exposure and ordering babies be given into care. You see, because the church took a stand, Rome embraced the teachings of Christ, enshrining the value of human life into the ethos of Western civilization. Athanasius lived the gospel in both word and deed, prompting the church to care for orphans and widows, rescuing abandoned children, and protecting the victims of abuse. He understood only too well the necessity of resistance and reformation. Yet for all his accomplishments, his epitaph, Athanasius Against the World, rang true. His friends, fellow pastors, and even members of his congregation betrayed and falsely accused him. And over the years, Athanasius was exiled from Alexandria 7 different times. It's a reminder today that when you stand up against the evils of culture, you will find enemies not only in the pagan society, but in the walls of the church against you. He was a man of courage who always did the right thing, even if he was doing it alone. These are just a few of the stories of the history and heritage of our faith. And it is a unified, bold, and comprehensive pro-life ethic. You know, Edward Gibbon, in his multi-volume behemoth, The Fall and Decline of Rome, ends up blaming Christianity. And so many years later, Tom Holland, who wrote the book Dominion that we quoted from at the beginning of the episode, writes an entire book debunking the central claim of Edward Gibbon's multi-volume work on the fall of Rome. Because Tom Holland had believed the culturally embedded message of Gibbon's book that Christianity was to blame. And all of his book is a counter to Edward Gibbon's work by saying, no, actually, it was only because of Christianity that Western civilization prevailed, was made great in the first place, and provided us in the West our ethos of the sanctity of human life and the dignity of the human being. And Tom Holland says this very interesting line. He says, the ancient world was incredibly cruel. Most modern secular people do not realize how much they have absorbed a Christian worldview. Concepts like the rule of law and human rights do not go back to the Greek and Roman philosophers. They go back to the New Testament. Most of us no longer realize the ripple effects of the New Testament, and we just take them for granted. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. They've gone mad because they've been isolated from one another and are wandering alone. The culture war today can be essentially summarized by saying that the left imbibes only certain aspects of Christendom and then infuses it with paganism and masquerades the corpse as ye old blessings of liberty. Christianity ought to bring together and a marriage of all of the virtues that made this civilization great. And until we return to that, abortion, trans cult mania, the sexualization of children, gay surrogacy, trans youth trafficking, thruples, and the UN's new push towards pedophilia, none of that is going to go away until, like Jill Pole, we remember the signs. Say them to ourselves when we wake in the morning and when we lay down at night and when we wake in the middle of the night. Yes, we should know our Bibles, but we must learn and teach our children and grandchildren the stories of the heroes of the faith, whose faith was defined by its opposition to the same kinds of evils that are so quickly being normalized again today in the West. There is nothing new under the sun. The question for us is, will we remember our great legacy, fostering it in our minds and in the minds of our children? They say things happen gradually, then suddenly. That's true for evil, but it's also true for righteousness. Everything starts in the home. And if we reclaim our heritage of Christian resistance and realize that activism, protests to all of these kinds of evils, that's not a Republican thing. That's not a conservative thing. That's not a political thing. That's a Christian thing. And until we remember that and live that out again, I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but I don't think anything's going to change. That's why everything that we do at the White Rose Resistance is to make the local church great again. That's why we tell these stories in our upcoming film. It's why we talk about them on the show. It's why I speak in so many churches. It's why we've screened my last film in over 13 or 1,400 churches. It's why we're making a new film. It's why we have resistance chapters that are under the kind of authority of a local pastor who's empowered one of his deacons or members to do this resistance activity with White Rose, because it all goes back to the local church. If that matters to you and you want to help what we're doing, go to thewhiterose.life, and become an ally of the White Rose Resistance. Support us. It means a lot. $35 a month or $70 a month or more if you want to give to our new film that we're making that's going to reawaken and mobilize the local church to remember who she is and get back in the business of resistance and reformation. Go to thewhiterose.life. Until next week, I'm Seth Gruber, and this is The Seth Gruber Show.